Okay, so back in 2005, Ontario made a huge promise. They set a deadline. By January 1st, 2025, the entire province would be fully accessible for people with disabilities. Well, that deadline is here, and it's passed. So, what happened? We're going to break down why this really ambitious 20-year goal was missed and what that actually means for the millions of people this whole thing was supposed to help.
And this quote, man, it really cuts right to the heart of it, doesn't it? What happens when someone who is totally capable of living an independent life is basically trapped by their own surroundings? You know, when the world just outside their front door simply isn't built for them.
You see, it's easy to talk about laws and deadlines in the abstract, but we can't forget there are real people behind all of this. And to really get what's at stake here, we have to look at the human cost of these failures.
So let's start right there. Let's talk about that human cost, because that's where you really feel the impact most deeply.
So I want you to meet Leon. Our sources describe him as being stuck at home, and it's not because of his disability, but because of what they call a failure of our Ontario government. On top of his own challenges, he's also dealing with his mom's recent hospitalization. But Leon isn't just staying silent. He actually hosts a disability advocacy radio show, and he's turning his personal struggle into a public platform for change. His story is just such a powerful reminder of the real lives behind all these policy debates.
So, how is a situation like Leon's supposed to be prevented in the first place? Well, it all goes back to this big promise that was made nearly 2 decades ago.
Right. So in 2005, the government passed something called the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. You'll probably hear it called AOD. And this thing was a huge deal, a landmark piece of legislation. It wasn't just, a nice suggestion. It was a law with a very specific and very ambitious goal: to find, remove, and prevent barriers for people with disabilities, period.
Now, they set a pretty ambitious timeline for this whole thing. The act passed in 2005, which started a 20-year countdown. And over the next 2 decades, all these accessibility standards were supposed to be rolled out across every sector. But then, January 1st, 2025 arrived, and the finish line? It hadn't been crossed.
And the gap between that goal and the reality today is just stark. The vision was a completely barrier-free Ontario. The reality, in the words of advocacy groups, is that the province is nowhere near that goal. So we're not talking about a near miss here. This was a massive shortfall.
Which, of course, brings us to the big question. With 20 years to get ready, what on earth went wrong? All right, let's dig into that.
Well, critics point to a few major things. First, enforcement was just not there. The rules were on the books, but there were hardly any consequences for ignoring them. That kind of suggests there wasn't a real political will to make it a priority. Second, the pace of change was just glacial. New standards would take years to develop, and then even longer to actually put in place. And the result? Barriers are still everywhere, from buildings without ramps to huge gaps in public transit, like in Toronto, where a lot of TTC stations still don't have elevators.
Okay, so the deadline came and went. The goal was missed. But you know what? That is not where the story ends, not by a long shot. The whole focus has shifted now.
Instead of being an endpoint, that missed deadline has kind of become a catalyst. It's re-energized the whole conversation and the fight for real, meaningful change.
And look, to be fair, it's not like nothing happened. There has been some progress. The sources we looked at point to some successes, like new investments to make campsites accessible and some specific employment initiatives. And those are definitely positive steps, but they're more like small fixes, not the complete system-wide overhaul that was promised.
And that brings us to the crucial point right now, this call to action. Advocacy groups aren't just pointing out what went wrong. They are demanding a renewed, and this is the key word, urgent commitment from all political parties to finally get this thing done. The patience has really run out.
So the conversation is totally shifted. It's not about some deadline way off in the future anymore. It's about closing the gap that exists right now, today, the gap between the Ontario that was promised and the Ontario that people with disabilities are actually living in.
And that brings us full circle, right back to where we started, the human cost. For every missed deadline and every broken promise, there are people like Leon still trying to navigate a world that just wasn't built for them. The promise of 2005 is still unfulfilled, and that leaves us with one really critical question. What happens now?